like to introduce our last panel for the day. Speaking to curating your statement for creative practice, how and what to highlight in your narrative. I'd like to introduce Shelly Fox from the School of Fashion, Nora Krug from Parsons School of Art, Media, and Technology, and Bill Morrish, Parsons School of Design Strategies.
First of all, we're going to kind of approach it from, again, the creative, much of what's been said, but from the side of someone probably coming in not from an academic background, but as one who has a lot of background in the field. And I had to sort of say, before I started my academic career, I had 2 architecture degrees. I don't know how much that's worth, but I had 2 of them. And I was immediately got involved in very non-architectural issues: politics, infrastructure, landscape architecture, and arts activism, which was everywhere now, but in the early 70s wasn't exactly the mainstream discussion in architecture. And so to come into, to want to teach in architecture programs in the middle to late 70s is a little difficult to sort of bring that into the table and say, what studio are you going to teach? Studio 2 or Studio 3? But somehow I figured it out. I've worked at 8 different institutions. I've gone through tenure and promotion to full professor. And I think it's also important to keep doing this because it isn't just about tenure. It is about promoting yourself through your full career. We don't talk a lot about promotion from associate to full and even being associate professors, but we really have to talk about that because it should be as rigorous as going through tenure in the sense of how we focus and become motivated. We can talk more about that. But also, how do I position myself? So I'm going to start very much from the business side, and Sven almost said it. Know your client. And you are making a presentation to, as you would a client, and you have to understand what their concepts are and fears and understanding and structure. And I've learned that from two different people along the way. One was actually a political leader in Minneapolis, Mayor Don Fraser, who was a very interesting mentor for me. When I was a director of a research center at the University of Minnesota, which sat between, here's 2 good places, between government and higher education. So these are 2 organizations that constantly have to define themselves. And in the middle of my 3rd to 4th year, I started receiving some really heavy criticism about what I was doing. And I was coming up for full professorship. And I said, how do I talk about this? This is, people are going to use this against me. And he said, no, absolutely not. As a mayor, it's really good when you get testy replies to the ideas that you're putting out because people are paying attention. And this is my comment to the Twitter. I could probably get into the Twitter, but what are they saying is really sort of saying what's going on. And from that point on, I was beginning to understand, so what I should do is actually not say I've done all these events, but what was I trying to put out into the realm, and what kind of feedback was I getting back, and how I was responding. And I thought, that sounds like what Jamer left, but sounds like Don Schoen's definition of design is the terms by which we name and frame the questions to be addressed. And I went, I guess that kind of comes together. The other mentor is Gene Block, who was provost at the University of Virginia, is now the chancellor at UCLA. I served at the university committee, which he chaired a very incredible committee at that time. And my case that he gave me was a mathematician who was trying to get tenure in the medical school. And this mathematician had no background in biology. So I figured if this person could get it, design can get tenure anywhere. So that was very interesting. I said, so how do I evaluate this? I don't know anything. I know some about medicine, but not anything about mathematics at this level or the genome and all of this. And he says, it's very simple. Look at why he was hired. Does the person describe, I was hired? This is the context I was hired under. Not, it was painful, but this is what I replied to. This is what I did taking the job. This is what I accomplished. This is where I took it, expanded, and engaged And the university revealed what was possible. I am now here, and this is where I'm going. And this is how I want to accomplish it. And more importantly, reconfirmed why it was a great idea you hired me. And I said, but that sounds so businesslike. And he goes, no, actually, he said, and his background was philosophy, it's a real rigorous philosophical approach. And I said, okay. That has served me very well, because how do I take all of these elements and that I was doing? Because a lot of people thought, well, you're doing all these things because you're really more interested in planning than architecture. And I would say, no, I'm actually really interested in architecture. And so I decided to frame myself saying, I'm an architect upriver, not an architect downriver. And that wasn't just a slight for everybody, but was just a position. Because I was also interested primarily in where the field was going, not where the field was. And so at that point, as I began to understand I was going to have to lead not only out in the community, but lead within the institutions because I saw a lot of issues there, I had to begin to really understand the situation that academic world operates under, which is not much different than trying to understand the dynamics of City Hall or any institution, actually. All institutions have this. So I began to come up with this idea, again, through some advice from these people who work in the moving ideas through complex world, is understand who the client is, understand where you are and where they are, and try to show the threads of the ideas. So when I say this, and academic says that, this means the same thing. But we're trying to get to different levels. So I started writing my work in relationship to it. And so it's like, this is really interesting. And somebody was saying, well, are you really saying one word is better than the other? And I was really saying, no, they're both useful because they describe an agenda. Then along the way so that's why the courses, why I picked this university, where I was going, how that position was also affecting my work, and how we always fail that. It sounds like the small stuff, but what you do in your practice, not like I did a certain project, but while I was in the project, I realized in trying to teach students, I was also having the same problem trying to communicate to the mayor, the same problem. And I found the question of communication. That's when I realized, for the architects, the word representation doesn't work in the public world, okay? So that the issue of communication became a dominant issue. So I had that kind of discourse. The other ones, of course, is loops. Began to actually think about how these ideas are flowing back. So you have to sort of thinking about what you're doing every day more than just the topic. And also project. Where do you think it's going? How is it going? In working in the university for the last 4 or 5 years, in meeting people, I see these trends. I see the opportunities. I see how things are going. Because now that I'm on the other side and we go through these things, I'm like saying, let's give this person tenure. They seem to know what they're doing. I don't want to go through this again. So this seems great. They're going to come and join us, and then we're going to continue on, all of us together in this same sort of energetic move towards shifting and changing into the future. So along the way, I figured out how to bring urban design plans. In my early dossier for tenure, I had lines of legislature statutes that I actually was involved in writing in an architectural, and I talked about, I put it under the category of specifications, which I thought was an interesting category. I also talked about the directions in fields and got various voices into that. I was able to talk about certain incidences within projects that I sort of felt were related to what was happening within classes or even in discussions of organizational structure within the university and on my service committees. One thing I do push back here at this university, and having been at many universities, we do have to open up the discussion of letters. It's way too narrow, and that we do need letters. We can get letters from non-academics that will be more deeper than, I know this guy who's really great, worked in my office kind of thing. But when I came up, I had letters from mayors who actually said, I wrote this letter personally because I think it's important. That's important. You can't just have associate professors. I had letters from various people. We're talking about community organizations, and we're down on the ground, and we're not allowed to have a letter coming in from the community organization that you spent the last 3.5 years with. It's a little odd process. So I'd say we all need to work on that. That's it. I got there. I got my beef out on the letters, and Sven left. So anyway. There you go.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I don't want to talk about the projects. I just brought them up as reference points because they kind of help talk about other things. But I think one of the things that everybody seems to have touched on that I've picked up so far is trying to understand who you are, where you've been, where you are now, where you're going. And I think that was really interesting when I came to Parsons, because I came in on a tenure track, so I didn't go through the PPR process. So when I put forward my tenure dossier, I had 1 year's teaching under my belt from Parsons, and of course I was brought in to set up the new MFA Fashion Design Society program at the time. And so of course, doing tenure, there was a lot of emphasis on my research, which is one of the reasons why I was hired. And going back to that question of, I used to ask when I was in the UK, what is a researcher? Because a little bit like Bill, I came from the industry. I was a fashion designer working in the industry with my own label, and I think many of us as practitioners, whatever that field might be in, is often that you're in the moment and you're producing work, and you keep going, and it gets behind you, and you just keep going, and you produce press, you do funding bids, and you do all sorts of things, and then you just do it. You keep records of things. I was quite a stickler for that, just because I'm that kind of person. Not because I didn't even know what tenure was when I came to the US, so you have to excuse me there. But I think one of the things that I was wanted to talk about that was always key in my work, just naturally, was just the way I researched as a designer. So it's just normally how I would work, and I didn't really have a framework for it, or I didn't really talk about it. And the only people I spoke to about my work or my influences and what made me tick was fashion journalism. And that's pretty scary when you talk to fashion journalists about Braille, or why is your collection about that? They just, they don't care. It's about seasons, it's about this and that and the other. So you're kind of sidelined even as a designer in that way. You're not part of the mass of fashion design, even as an industry. But the reason why I picked some of these early pieces up is because the Braille Collection was a collection I did in 1999, and I'm able to reflect back, but it's not because I think it's the most important one. It's a way of me being able to help with my narrative. It was something in 1998. It was something that I developed through something that was very keen to me, but also then looking back at all the places that this collection had been to. It came from a fashion collection. I funded it. It wasn't something that I got funding for. It was actually part of my work that I sell to stores. So even the word researcher, I didn't even use that. Then it became part of something that was much later on called Archaeology of the Future, which fast forward to 2009, it was the most 20 years of trend forecasting. So someone like Lee Edelcourt had picked up on the collection and shot this collection almost 10, 15 years prior. So it was almost like other people were tracking my work for me in some kind of way. So I was able to tap into that. And I'm just showing you catalogues and when we worked with Jürgen Teller, when we've done exhibitions in London, Renault Cars pulled the whole, all the research in for their clients to talk about research. And then one of the things that became really key for me later on, when I already moved to Parsons to New York, there was a writer, a designer from IDEO was writing this book called Design Meets Disability. Because I knew I was on tenure track, the fact that this is when I became a little bit more aware. I wasn't unaware, but I was more like tracking things. So because it was printed by MIT, I knew that okay, people that don't know anything about fashion research and the fact that fashion isn't, to many people, even seen as a serious subject in terms of its practice often and where its ideas come from. I knew by having MIT attached to it, it would be taken seriously, or at least some people will be able to contextualize it in some other way. So the work over the last, since 1998, that collection, it's interesting. It's not something, I talked to my students about this. When I did this collection, I didn't think, oh, right, great, I'll get an exhibition, there'll be a book, there'll be a catalogue, it will be part of Liaison course, etc., etc. It's just something that was very important to me as a designer and then became a life of its own, so ended up traveling exhibition-wise, internationally, etc., and being part of really important books. I think, again, I'm going off track somewhat, but again, I brought a project here called Noble Textiles. This is when I became much more nuanced, if you like, as a fashion researcher at Central St. Martin's. And I remember when they first asked me to be a researcher, I didn't really know what they were talking about. I was just doing my work, and they were like, no, we'd like you to be a researcher. And I said, what do I do? And so I was explaining that. They just said, just do what you do. And then I became part of this other academic world. I was already teaching anyway, but what I realized is that I was bringing my work into the classroom automatically because that's the kind of ideas that I felt were important for students to understand outside the narrow world of runway collections. And being with academics, I realized that I was able to, especially fashion theorists, I was able to talk about my work more eloquently because they would ask me the right questions. So it's like being interviewed, but not by fashion press, but more like fashion theory, art critics who really understood the bigger context of where your work could come from. So I think, looking back, one of the main things that I did for this, for the narrative, there was a key book that somebody wrote about me way back when, in about 2000. Caroline Nevin, she's a very top fashion theorist. And I never read stuff after I've done the interview. I put it on the shelf and I never read it. And when it came to doing the narrative, I said, how do I talk about my work? I have this interview that I've never read, and the lady who does the workshops with us outside of, she had no idea about the fashion industry. She said, well, maybe you need to go back and read that book. And actually, I went back and read it 10 years later. And I realized that I'd already articulated who I was as a designer. But she was able to write about it more than I could ever write about it. So it's this kind of way of learning about yourself through other people's eyes that I found really interesting. And it was able to help me write my narrative in a very, very straightforward, honest way, which I think was, who are you, what do you do, and write it down. And it was hard because writing is not something I enjoy, to be honest, but I think it really helped me to reflect by talking to many, many different types of people. So that was my story, really. Anyway, I think that's it.
Hi, I'm Nora. I'm in illustration, and I got tenure in 2010, and I don't know if I would have called myself a practitioner per se, but I think didn't see myself as an academic in the first place. So I also just had 2 years of teaching experience previously, of professorship with tenure track before. And I came here and, to a very different academic environment that was very exciting, and that also made me realize that I had to redefine what I was doing and why in a very new way. And my career had been quite diverse. At that point, I had come from the field of documentary film and graphic design, but I'd also, been an illustrator for several years. And but I for a long time, I I just wasn't somebody who knew, you know, starting out at in my career, that I wanted to do only one particular thing or call myself only one particular thing. And so as an illustrator, I had done commercial work, editorial illustration, children's book, graphic novels, work for galleries, animation, but I'd also been working on a series of non-fiction visual narratives about the lives of people who have experienced war. And that was actually very close to my thinking in which I approached documentary film, because it was about, you know, non-fiction and trying to understand something about society, interviewing people, and then finding a visual way of communicating that information. So what I did was I really looked at all the work that I had done as an illustrator, documentary filmmaker, designer, and researcher, because my work is very much influenced by research, even though I don't write about illustration as a medium. And I asked myself, what are the main questions, basically, that my work addresses? And I try to find the kind of a common ground between all these things. So what are the main questions I ask myself as a human being that I want to address in my work as well? And I realized it was really that tension or connection or relationship between the visual and the political. And so that's how I structured my narrative as well. I basically, that's the red, do you call it red line in English? That I was following through the whole narrative. So, for example, when talking about my commissioned work, I was thinking about, I mean, I've done a lot of work for the New York Times, specifically for the Abet page, which is always about a political issue. And so to me, that was also part of that, you know, having to come up within the course of 4 hours with an idea that communicated a political idea, was as political an act in a way of communicating something as were my visual narratives that I took several months to develop. So I try to contextualize everything around that perspective. And I had also, specifically at Parsons, found a way of connecting this particular interest to my service and teaching activities. So, for example, teaching, I developed a class together with Vicky Hattam, who's a political science professor at NSSR, called Visual Politics, which we've been co-teaching for the past 8 years, I think, to Lang, NSSR, and Parsons students, where students have to both create images or, you know, art around political issues, everyday political issues, but also write about it and analyze it. And so that class directly related to my own research and continues to do so. I mean, I find it really enriching to see these, you know, how my research and the teaching, it really goes both ways. I also organized a symposium together with Vicky called Picturing Politics, where we invited visual artists from all over the world, mainly illustrators, to talk about their work as political artists. So that would be one example for how I approach this in my service capacity. So what I did in my narrative is I had these 3 categories: research, service, and teaching, but I divided each of them into subcategories. So, for example, in the service category, I laid out a few key things that are important to me. So one was fostering social and political awareness. Another one was creating a platform for interdisciplinary collaboration, because my work had always been very interdisciplinary. And the third one was deepening theoretical research. So I tried to be as clear as possible about what my own perspective was in this academic context. So, I mean, you've heard so many people speak today, and I'm sure you've heard many different perspectives, and I just wanted to, I think, clarify that I don't think the school or any of the committees reviewing the the dossiers are looking for one particular way of doing things, one particular research path or way of teaching or teaching philosophy. So as Sven said, I think it's really, and everybody else really, it's really important to be honest and to think about who you are and how you contribute to the school, and try to be as clear about that as possible in the dossier. Instead of trying to kind of tweak things because you think, one particular thing might appeal to the university more than other things. So that's what I tried to do by dividing the service section into these key interests of mine and then giving examples. So giving examples is very, very important. A lot of times I've read narratives where claims are basically made, and it's very hard to imagine how they were then translated into a class or into a service activity. So I think it's very important that when you say you're doing something, that you also explain how you've done it, and maybe even in the appendix show student work that reflects those ideas. So examples and cross-referencing is very, very important. Contextualizing too, when I talked about my research, when you talk about prizes or competitions, not everybody necessarily knows how important these organizations are that are giving you these prizes. So it's very, very, or conferences you're invited to, or you can really apply it to anything. It's very important that you contextualize it just with a few sentences for whoever is reading this. So, this is one of the most important illustration organizations in North America, for instance. And I really, became very, very specific with numbers. So for example, one competition I was included in, there were 11,300 entries and 400 were selected. So I think it's that's a very just straightforward, factual way of giving, just giving people a sense of what, how many people apply for these things and how many people get them. What else? I'm jumping around a little bit, but I think your personal perspective is very, very important. And so with teaching and service as well as in your research, I think it's very important, if you can, to develop classes that are really your own and that reflect something about the work that you're most interested in as a researcher too. And to write about that, why did you develop this class and how does it connect to your research? And similarly with the service. I mean, another example for the political, interest that I have is that I developed several umbrellas that allowed for new introductions of classes that were centered around political issues. So that was one service contribution that I did. I'm just trying to think if there's something else. And of course, it's also important and great to take opportunity of whatever is offered at this school. So if there are research grants here at Parsons that you can apply for, I think that's a very good way of keeping on building your research and explaining in the dossier why you applied and how this research helped you in pushing further with your investigations. Also, I think this has probably been talked about, but so constructing a narrative around the key issues that are important to you, I think is crucial, but also thinking about the trajectory, where are you coming from and where are you going? So it's not only about the snapshot of who you are at this moment in time or who you were, but how did you start out with this investigation around those issues? And how did you get where you are now? And what are you planning to do next? So to include a temporal element there that doesn't just take you out of context as who you are in that moment, but that shows us that there's a narrative about what you do and why you do it, even if it changes. I mean, again, I don't think it's expected that somebody sticks with the same topic for 10 years or the same research methods or the same medium. If there is a shift, even a major one, that's of course, a very important thing. And then you can write about that, why you decided to shift in that way and how what you've done before might have even caused that shift. So it's really not that anybody's expecting one particular thing, but that you try to phrase as clearly as possible as you can what you're doing and why, and what you're planning to do in the future. I mean, teaching philosophy, you know, again, it's important not to just write what you think people want to hear, but to really think about what teaching means to you and to be honest about how you've maybe improved your teaching skills, you know, approach teaching differently than 3 years ago. Yeah, I think that's all I can think of right now.
I remember Nora's case. It was very nice.
George Tragan is going to join us for Q&A. I'll provide a little perspective. Mike, I have 2 questions, and actually, Christian, one of these you're going to like. One is, I'll ask a question that regards to work we're doing first. How does a more entrepreneurial practice fit into this? How would a more entrepreneurial practice fit into this context? How would or people are doing more entrepreneurial work within the university or outside? How does that play into this context?
Well, it's no different. I mean, entrepreneur work in the sense of business, but activist work within the political realm. Why am I out, you know, running mayoral campaigns and whatever? It is in some regards it's actually thinking about implementing ideas and ideas that you know are relevant and actually going into the machinery where it exists and see how they play out. And so, because everybody says, oh, you're just, you know, in the politics, and I go, well, we're always talking about politics and architecture and political space and so forth, but I don't know really how it works. And so, how do I go in there? The other thing too is we tend to there are about 3 definitions of research, by the way, and one that we really need to use more heavily is applied research. And you know, MIT and others, most MIT is applied research. Very little of it is primary research. And so within the applied research, there's a lot of entrepreneurial opportunity in it. I mean, all of the design school in MIT is all under primary research, applied research.
Also want to say that if we look at the faculty handbook, they speak not only about the research and scholarship, but also professional practice. So the entrepreneurial aspect, I guess, fits perfectly in the professional practice, where we can see also discovery and new ideas, which can be applied later on in teaching, in the realm of teaching.
So it might be professional practice or applied research in the sense that it's asking new questions, or it's not just having a practice, right?
But it's, we'll just sort of say knowing your clients and embedded if we think of the institutional memory, there's still this notion, let's say before even Stanford got it rolling through SRI, is that, oh, those are those people who are getting patents for money and so forth. That's not really academics. The problem is, and that's still embedded in there, and what you have to do is knowing that's there, is to move out of that and say, this is a business, but it's about, you know, the generating ideas, producing audience, and actually opening up that conversation, aware that that's the only way people are thinking about it.
Yeah, I think it's more about perspective. I mean, I've also done a lot of commissioned work, but I think there's a difference between, you know, if you basically just follow a client's brief, you know, commercial in that sense, that your conceptual thinking is not at all involved. And, you know, no matter how great or well-known or big the client is, I think if your work is entirely, you know, if you're doing mostly creative practice, you can still have a perspective as a thinker. And, you know, it can be a visual investigation. But I think it's only a problem if you're basically just following a client's orders and you're not involved as a thinker or artist in the process, I think.
This is where there's clarity, exactly as Julie said. Every time you encounter RSCP described in the faculty handbook, across categories, across types of review, renewal, tenure, ranked review, etc. Scholarship is, RSCP includes professional practice, but the messaging on this is very irregular and asymmetric because we've heard administrators in high positions describe, for example, in architecture, a building is not RSCP. And that is really problematic because if the claim is that somehow you are supposed to magically produce a building which doesn't fit neatly into summer months, construction meetings, client meetings, contracts, I mean the absurdity of taking professional practice and somehow trying to frame it in terms of the academic year and those cycles, it just completely eviscerates what that creative practice is. And you're not, as Nora's getting at, you're not following just a guideline for client. You're oftentimes combating that client, negotiating, compromising, as well as other professionals, let alone you may have multiple human lives in your own office whose lives you have to manage and coordinate as well. So there's a complexity of types of professional practice that can be very weirdly skewed into misrepresenting the place of that skill and talent in the academics setting. And that's a tricky issue for us to think about because it's an open-ended question. How much does the institution then support that practice, that professional practice vis-a-vis funding, et cetera? School funding, cross-school funding, provost office funding. There's lots of nuance there, but we should really talk about it before we somehow come out with broad brush statements that say building a building is not scholarship, that somehow you're supposed to then write books and papers about that to disseminate the work. The building is being disseminated as people move through it.
Right. Thank you for that comment, and I think it grows up my comment on this. About 2 years ago, I received, I submitted for, what's the first step?
PR.
Sorry?
PR.
Yeah, PR, sorry, forget the names. So too many acronyms, and I'm not American, so it's always hard to keep up with you guys. I
That's like
received
PRI.
Yeah, and one of the things that confused me the most of the letter that I received is that a lot of the work I do, but not everything except my writing, it's collaborative through directing a very complex form of urban practice, right? And so I work with teams and coordinate teams of more than 20 people on all different kinds of disciplines, right? And there were comments there that allude to the issue that you have to say which is yours. If you work in a collaboration, like you perfectly said, I mean, you're building, just a building is like hundreds of people that perhaps are involved in doing that. And in which way, most of you guys that are in there, if you work at that level, how the hell do you describe that? I mean, because I mean, getting into the vicissitudes like, oh, I took that decision, oh, I didn't take that decision, even though I'm the leader of the project, you know, becomes something that it's quite complex to explain, you know, especially when you're working in such, you know, project with that dimension. So adding to that, you know, that was something that really confused me and actually put me off a bit on the review that I have in PPR. It's like, oh, well, you were working with all these kinds of people, but what is exactly yours? And it's like, what the hell do you mean what is exactly mine? I really don't even have the capacity of describing that, you know, because the projects are produced in a very highly complex environment. So I don't know if anyone has something to say about this in terms of recommendations on how to actually describe this, but it's something that has been haunting me for some time, you know. How do I, this is one of the comments that I received, I was like, how am I going to deal with this? You know, like, what is exactly mine? And so, yeah.
I think the two key words are attribution and contribution. You have to make sure that you attribute to your partners, your collaborators, their role in this project, to name them, to maybe there are different stages and there were different partners involved. So make sure that in your CV and your narrative, you have a mention to them, and then reflect on your own contribution. What do you feel you contribute to the project? Where you might differentiate your role from other partners. Maybe sometimes you split the work, or sometimes you have to sit together and think together, as Shelly described before. sometimes working with the others help you promote and further your thinking. So just to reflect carefully, honestly on these two aspects. Who else do you attribute these works, and what is your own contribution?
And if you, like you say, it's a complex system or process, then describe the complexity, you know, so that whoever is reading it can understand what that means. How exactly do you work in the group? You know, what is the dynamic? I think, again, a lot of it is about clarity, you know, creating a picture that's just as detailed as possible.
Well, there's not only importance, but what ideas are you pursuing, okay? And you know me, I think probably have maybe one project that I did myself. So I could list the city of Minneapolis, but it's a long list. But and you write the situation, the context. These are the kinds of problems you pursue to work in and you seek out. So this is my research context. So one thing you get out of it is how to produce work within something that's highly collaborative, right? You literally go and say, this is the urban situation I seek to work in and understand. Within it, I am both participating with certain skills because I know it, but I'm also an observer of it as well. And these are why I pursue these kinds of work. And so you actually promote this complexity as the object of study. And that's how all of a sudden said, well, we never thought that politics could be architecture, or more importantly, why we never saw infrastructure as buildings, right? Because it takes 15 years. Now it's easier, now you hear the word all the time, but it goes back to that point. But I had to sort of say, I'm seeking these questions. And so I've inserted myself into these projects. And because they have multiple results. And some of it you pull out and some of it continues on. So I think that helps understand that you're embodying that kind of work.
I mean, as an illustrator, I always work alone. It's the sad truth about my profession. So I can't,
But
you know,
in your head, it's really active.
crowded.
Exactly.
It's crowded up there. So I can't really, of course, I can't talk about your profession, but I assume that there are certain ideas that you specifically bring to the table, and ideas that other people bring to the table, or maybe things that you oversee more strongly than certain aspects of a project. So I think that's what I would be interested in finding out.
Yeah, and your work, as you know, you bring a very specific thing into it, and beyond all the other sharing. So there's both the larger situation and the specific thing that you really like the most and focus heavily on as you do everything else. And so just put yourself in the crowd, and identify what you do and how you play. It is an attribution of, every character, usually gets sometimes caught in that trap. You say you're the co-principal investigator, then people get in the mentality of who the sub lists and,
I think also, I'm just thinking of a tiny project I did once, but I realize now looking back it was significant change for me of how I work now, but it came out of a financial situation where our backers pulled out of a show that we were going to do in Paris, but we were already working with Show Studio. But this is when, in 2002, when Show Studio, nobody did fashion films, and it was not even done. And so, people think of the fashion designer as a singular, but in fact, every fashion designer cannot produce anything on their own. And so I think for me, when I came out of that project, it was the most, although I was upset because we couldn't show in Paris, but what happened was I ended up collaborating with a still photographer, moving filmmaker, sound producers, a whole teams of people, and the whole Show Studio team, and they became good long life collaborators. But also just by doing that, you also got that peer without me realizing it's Show Studio, it's Nick Knight. There's a level of, and also we were one of the first designers to have a film on Show Studio, and it really impacted how I wrote the curriculum for the MFA. I brought film and photography into the MFA, and so my students now work with professors from the AMT and a film and photographer, and so it's, and it was only at the point when internet was becoming important, but it was really good for me to acknowledge that and realize how I actually, it took me back to, because I knew my company was going to stop, so it kind of took me back to realizing how I really like working, which was actually collaborative anyway, and that's always been my favorite bit, working with sound designers and filmmakers. And so it was, but I was able to articulate it through that way. So it was a failure, but it became an interesting project through collaboration.